Hello, my name is Brinley Fehrenbacher, and I'm giving my speech on how to bake your own homemade bread. The general purpose is to inform, and the specific purpose is to inform my audience on how to make their own bread from scratch. And the thesis or central idea is making homemade bread is cheap, delicious, and easy to make. And I can start. The Holy Bible quotes Jesus Christ in Matthew chapter 4, verse 4, saying, "Man shall not live by bread alone." Although this statement may be true both doctrinally and nutritionally, bread has been a staple of mankind's diet for generations. Homemade bread has always been one of my favorite foods, and as an avid carb lover, I've recently taken to baking as one of my hobbies. Making homemade bread is cheap, delicious, and relatively easy to make. Anyone can learn how to do it. However, few people know how to make their own bread. It's a skill that is becoming less and less common. Today, I'm going to show you how to prepare, knead, and bake your own homemade loaf of bread. Let's start with our first step. The first step to making the perfect homemade loaf of bread is creating the dough. The recipe that we'll be using is Grandma's Country White Bread by Andrea Nelson. This recipe is posted on Andrea's blog, Pennies and Pancakes. I picked this recipe because it is a classic bread that is good for sandwiches, toast, or just plain with butter spread on top. This recipe produces 2 loaves that cost about 34 cents each when you are done. It is also very basic, so it's a good bread for a beginner baker to start on. Let's go over the ingredients we will be using. For our wet ingredients, we will need 3 cups of lukewarm water and 1/3 cup of oil. The dry ingredients include 1 1/2 tablespoons of yeast, 1 tablespoon of salt, 1/4 cup of sugar, and 6 to 7 cups of unbleached ground white wheat flour. You can also use all-purpose flour, but in the recipe it tells you that if you use regular all-purpose flour, you'll need about 8 cups instead. It also says that if you use regular flour, you'll end up with a bread that is not as coarse as the ground wheat flour bread. For this purpose, and because it's easier to find in the store, we will be using the regular all-purpose flour. As with baking almost any kind of bread, the order of how you mix your ingredients can change the texture. We will start by using a large mixing bowl and pouring the 3 cups of lukewarm water in. Add the yeast into the water and stir and let it sit for about 10 minutes. Notice how it is bubbling? According to The Accidental Scientist, an educational website dedicated to the science of cooking, yeast is a single living cell organism that is classified as a fungi. It's dormant until it comes into contact with warm water. Once we add the flour and the sugar, the yeast will feed on the sugars and will release carbon dioxide as a byproduct. The carbon dioxide in the dough will cause the bread to rise. After the yeast has sat for about 10 minutes, we can add our 1/3 cup of oil, salt, and flour. Andrea recommends that we add 6 cups of flour first and then add the remaining cups while we are kneading our dough. Now that we have our dough, the next step is to knead it. Kneading the dough is very important because it affects the texture. According to James P. Dewan, a chef, column writer for the Chicago Tribune, and professor, wheat flour has 2 proteins in it, glutenin and gliadin, that combine to make gluten, that wheat protein we hear about all of the time. Another food enthusiast, Bethany Munsell, a cookbook author with a bachelor's degree in nutritional science, tells us that when these 2 proteins are mixed together, they have no order or structure. Think of them like a knotted ball of yarn. As you knead the dough, the gliadin and the glutenin start to form strands that make gluten. The more you knead, the more the gluten strands are developed. Think about your yarn strands being combined together to create braids. These strands are what trap the carbon dioxide from the yeast and allow the bread to rise. For this bread recipe, we will need to hand knead the dough for about 6 to 10 minutes, adding flour as we go. As I've started baking, I've learned that it gets easier to know what your dough should look and feel like the more you do it. This recipe says that our bread should become smooth, elastic, very slightly sticky, and pull away from the bowl. I like to cover my hands in flour before I start kneading the dough because it makes it so that the flour doesn't stick to me as much. Use strong movements and stretch the dough and have a little fun with it. By the time you are done kneading the dough, you should have used about 8 cups of flour and your dough should have some strength to it, but it should still be pretty elastic. Now that your dough is all kneaded, we're going to allow the bread to rise by covering it with either plastic wrap or a dish towel and leave it in a warm place for about an hour until it has doubled in size. Andrea suggests that you can either leave it on your counter or put it in the oven with the light on with a bowl of warm water below it to speed up the rising process. I like to turn my oven on preheat and let the dough sit on top of my stove. Our last step to making the perfect bread is punching, proofing, and baking it. Once our dough has doubled in size, we will need to punch it down. Red Star Yeast, a company that sells live baking yeast, tells us that despite this rough-sounding term, punching the dough just means that we are removing some of the carbon dioxide that has built up inside of it. Doing this helps make the bread be a finer grain and moves the yeast cells, wet ingredients, and sugar around. This improves our final proofing or rising, the stage before we put our dough in the oven. So gently press your dough and knead it and take care not to use too much pressure. Now that our dough is punched down, we can put it in our pans. Split the dough into 2 and form each one into a loaf. Grease the pans and gently lift each loaf into a pan. Now we will cover these loaves and let them have their final proof or rise until they are about 1 or 2 inches above the rim of the pans. Once they have risen, we bake them at 375 degrees for 25 minutes. When they are done baking, immediately remove them from their pans and set them on a cooling rack. Now you have your final product. Your bread should be golden brown on top and be soft and white on the inside. It can be served immediately, and Andrea suggests slicing it and serving it with butter and honey. This bread can be stored by sealing them in an airtight bag, and the recipe says you can freeze both the dough and the bread. Now you can enjoy your bread with your friends and family. Let's review all of the things that we have learned today. Making your own bread is simple once you understand the steps of how to bake it. First, mix together your water, yeast, flour, and other simple ingredients to create a sticky, supple, yet elastic dough. Second, hand knead your dough with flour to create a solid gluten structure to trap the carbon dioxide and let it rise. Third, punch down, proof, and bake your bread to golden brown perfection to complete your scrumptious loaf. I hope that I've been able to effectively teach you the skill of making homemade bread in your own kitchen. And even though you may not live by bread alone, now you can make your own delicious loaf to share with your friends and family.